Welcome back. Interesting sessions this morning, and we are continuing in a similar tone. So, our next guest, Dr. Roland, did I say that right? Thank you. Is a co-founder of FutureCamp. So, since 2001, he has been responsible for all service and consulting activities in the business area of emission trading and climate protection. Dr. Geres, please join us and tell us more.
First of all, also a very warm welcome from my side, and I would like to thank Vedrana for the very kind invitation. I'm really proud to be in a position to contribute to this fantastic conference. And I'm also here to learn. And what I share in terms of emotions, Vedrana, I'm also a little bit nervous. That's not typical for me if I'm on the stage. But I'm not a techie. I'm far away from a techie. I'm representing those kind of baby boomers that started their professional life, in my case, within a public authority, where we have been proud to have received telefaxes as a modern technology. The first electronic data transfer I witnessed was that somebody stored data, typed in with 2 fingers, of course, within a floppy disk, and took the floppy disk and brought it to another office. So, of course, this changed dramatically. And I would like to emphasize a little bit more on some phrases you are not familiar with. When I got the invitation and started to prepare my presentation for today, I looked in the schedule and I thought, oh my God, half of the words, I don't know what it really means. So I can promise I also will confront you with some terms you may not know. So, and that's maybe the bridge for doing it together. So I added a second headline presentation slide in order to make you aware of the hugest legislative package that I've ever witnessed. I'm working in the field on energy and climate-related issues since 30 years now. And we are witnessing a very dynamic approach driven by the European Union Commission, the Parliament, but also the Member States on energy and sustainability-related legislation. I will get to that a little bit, and the climate targets are in the heart, and you see many buzzwords here that also, some of them I've witnessed in the starting session today, also had been noted yesterday within the workshop session. So what I would like to do is to give you a very short overview. It's not an advertising block, but you should know where I'm coming from and where our clients typically are. Then I'm talking on climate neutrality. What is it and how to get there? Then let us change the focus a little bit and have a look into the industry. And I mean the heavy industries, the energy intensive industries. To be short, in your community, and I also will refer to some of the presentations and the contributions from the presenters of yesterday and today, more or less is in an enabling role. That's my perception. But the basic question, of course, is, are you enabling? So that's my definition of value. It's not just on economics, it's also on how do we take care on the planet and the resources that definitely are limited. So therefore, let us have a look into the industries, especially those industries that have innovation cycles that are far longer, and especially investment cycles that are far longer. A blast furnace, for example, within the steel industry is operated for at least 30 years. In practice, 40 years. To change this and to change this technology is one investment in your professional lifetime. One. So you need a roadmap. You need a very detailed basis on knowledge on how to become climate neutral that is completely different from the kind of companies you are representing. So on my company, we are 100% independent, owned by myself and my partner, located in Munich, in the same building as Costa. That's one of the reasons why we found the way to each other. We are working on climate-related issues and corporate climate protection since 2001. So more than 20 years now. And As many of you may know, it has been a niche issue also for consultancies for many years, but now we are out of the niche. So my organization, for example, doubled within the last 3 years. So we already heard about the need to have some empathy for your customers. I guess Uli was the one who used that phrase that morning. And the same is true for us. So we are working with very, very different clients. The major part is industry, especially in manufacturing industries, but also governmental institutions, of course, including the government itself within Germany. The service sectors, also the financial sector. For example, we helped to build up an emissions trading desk for UniCredit Hypovereinsbank in Germany 15, 20 years ago, when the new instrument at that time was introduced. Just to give you an idea. What is climate neutrality? I know you should not read within a presentation, but I kindly ask you if it's possible to read that headline. Can you read it? Okay. It is an advertisement from 1962. I'm born 1965. And the headline is, "Each day humble," it's more or less the nickname of the name of the company, it's an oil company, "supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier." They had been proud on the energy provided to the market. Of course, that's the purpose of the company. And of course, nobody, even an oil and gas company, would do advertisement like this today. So it completely changed. Also the perception on the issue on climate change changed. The European Union came up, you don't need to read. The European Union came up with a definition on what climate neutrality is. And it's more or less, it's based on the definition that has been acknowledged on the global level within the Paris Agreement in 2015, and it's the basis for all European Union legislation. And the basic idea is to have a balance between the remaining emissions of the European Union, that's the orange area here in that slide, and it's the concept of net emissions. So meaning, even in the year 2050, we will not have zero emissions. We'll have some industrial processes that will be connected with emissions. We will still have agriculture, for example, as a sector that will contribute with emissions. So we need to balance it also by improving removals, like, for example, changing land use practices, changing practices how to manage forests, of course, stopping deforestation, that is also happening inside the European Union, and so on. And also creating technical sinks, meaning separating carbon dioxide and storing it, for example, in aquifers down the North Sea. So that's the processes going on. So transformation within that is not a stepwise approach. We are really in a situation where we face fundamental technological changes within industries. So that's the target of the European Union, and the whole legislation is directed to this target. What does this mean for a company? Organizations are very different, of course. It's a difference if you do a company carbon footprint, a calculation on the carbon dioxide emissions that are related with the business of a company. If you look at a tech company, for example, or if you look at a steel producer or a basic chemical producer, or if you look at a governmental authority like, for example, the state administration of a federal state in Germany with 200, 300,000 people working for that organization. So, but the general approach is more or less similar with different emphasizements as part of the balances. You start to look from outside. What might be the contribution of the company on helping to tackle the problem on the one hand, but also where does the company contribute to the problem itself? We all are contributing to the problem if we are acting as consumers, also as private persons, coming to this conference, for example. We need to do a company analysis to have a look into the company, and the first step is the carbon footprint. I will give you an example of cross-DACH in a couple of minutes. To define a target, where would I like to be? And it's more or less easy to say I would like to become climate neutral by 2045. So at least the other people in the room that are sharing my generation can be sure we will not be in the offices in 2045 anymore. Probably not. Probably that's also better for the companies if one day we are not in the office anymore. But we need to come up with measures in the mid and in the short term, and that's the decisive steps. That's where we look at, and that's where also, for example, financial sector, banks, insurances are looking at much more detailed as compared to a couple of years ago. So we are talking about measures to reduce emissions. For example, using other means of transportation. For example, producing our own electricity, installing PV on the rooftops, as it is the case within Gross here in Croatia. Not yet in Munich, simply due to the fact that we rented an office and we need to convince the owner. Just to give a small insight. So that's an integrated. But we will. We will, of course. So, okay, in order to do this, to come up with a carbon footprint, we need to define the boundaries we are looking at, the system boundaries. And these also might be different. And the next step then is to acquire the data. And that's exactly part of the role that many of you might play within that field. Not just to acquire the data, but also to, I would say, to operate the data, that it really makes use and add value for the users. Please be aware that many companies are in a situation now that they have mandatory reporting requirements. It's not a voluntary exercise anymore. This is also true for the tech companies. They need to report on their emissions. It is driven by legislation, but it's also driven by customer demands that simply ask you for your carbon footprint as in your role as a supplier. That's, for example, the case within the automotive sector already. And of course, this is placing a challenge that is much huger in the case you're producing steel or basic chemicals as compared to a service provider. So you can use, there are different methods existing. I don't bore you with detailed technical standards for company carbon footprints, for organizations also doing a similar exercise for products or single events like, for example, a conference, or also on certain aspects of industries like, for example, logistics. Just to give you an insight, when we started to calculate the logistic emissions for a huge chemical company, we received 10,000 logistic movements. An Excel file. Not that easy to handle, to make sure that the data taken out of that are also representative and useful in order to steer and to change logistics where it is possible. Just to give you an overview, what are the typical scopes? So we use a scope concept from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. That's a more or less established standard worldwide. Also the European Union legislation is referring to that standard. You have direct emissions like your own facilities, your own cars, or your own plants. Not in the service sector typically, but within the industries. We all are purchasing energy, heat, and especially electricity. And those two scopes, this is called scope 2, and those two scopes are mandatory always. And then the big challenge is the scope 3, makes it much more difficult. What is happening outside your company? What is the embedded emission within a bottle of water, for example, or within a mouse or a mouse pad, or what is the embedded emission within a laptop or a server infrastructure? So this can be very challenging to come up with accurate data on that. So there are different categories upstream, and the same is true downstream. I skip this. Let us have a look at cross-DACH. Peter, Joachim, sorry, I didn't show you the figures before. So no chance to do anything about it, but I would like to emphasize it's preliminary because we need to discuss a few items. You can't see, probably some of you, the yellow bar on the downside of the slide. That is the Scope 1 emissions. The Scope 2 emissions, electricity purchase is not visible here, simply due to the fact that you are purchasing green electricity. And as it's allowed to make use of market-based balancing systems, we do this, and so it's counted as 0. But you can also see the Scope 3 here. It's roughly 50 tons of annual emission within the first year. So for roughly 15 people sharing the same offices like us, the same building. So that's interesting, and that's a typical view for a service-oriented company, and especially in that case also a newly founded company. Why that? Sorry, but I know there are some engineers in the room for that. Here are the detailed figures. And hopefully in a couple of time, we will have better as an Excel file that is also used here. And you see there's one category dominating. One is purchased goods and services, and the other one is capital goods. That is really dominating the emissions balance so far. The capital goods are, for example, the cars rented. And the embedded emissions within a Tesla or within another vehicle. So just to give you an idea, and you see there are also categories inside that do not really play a role. And that's the sense, or that's the purpose of that first exercise, to find out where is my footprint? Where is it? Which are the numbers that are of relevance and which are not? And after that, we can decide on which data to acquire, in which level of quality, and how to process it. Of course, we should have a look at the most important ones. So overall, roughly 50 tons, more than we expected when we started that. And we need to have some discussions on maybe on some changes in the balance before we scale it up to the group. Another concept, who is in the room have heard about science-based targets? Please raise your hand. Okay, only a couple of people. That's a concept that was driven especially by the World Wildlife Fund, that is also referred to quite often by many industries, also by banks. And the concept is that's your emission, bring down your emissions, and you see the time frame here within the next 5 to 10 years, roughly to 50%. Further decrease your emissions later on. Try to also develop first removals, for example, by enabling other people to plant trees, to make use of a simple example. And you're also encouraged to do abatement, emission reductions, or removals beyond your value chain. That has been called compensation in the past. In the meantime, it is replaced by the phrase of contribution, in order to emphasize even more that we all should try to reduce our emissions and not just purchasing carbon credits and offset our emissions. Offsetting, that's something, and it also gives you an insight on utilization of, in that case, it's electronic registry that is run by the Gold Standard. The Gold Standard is an organization also founded by the WWF. Yes. And here you can see the retirement of a certain amount of offsets for 1,000 tons, representing 4,000 tons of emissions that we did on behalf of the federal state of Thuringia for their own administrative travel. Yeah? It is only the travel of the governmental institutions of the Free State. And you can see here it's completely transparent. You can even check, you can go into the database and check where is the project, does it really work, who is the owner, who developed the documentation, and all that stuff. The transfer itself is relatively easy. It's like online banking. But it's an infrastructure that has been developed throughout the last 20 years. So there's a lot of implicit knowledge behind. Some drivers with a focus on industry. A lot of drivers. That's something I encourage you to read afterwards. I only tip on a few points. One important driver is carbon pricing. Another ones are requests on changes in the markets. For example, the dramatic changes we witnessed due to the war in the Ukraine at the beginning, early last year, with a completely change in energy prices throughout the whole European Union, with Germany especially hit by that. Also, changes in terms of regulation with sustainability reporting as a requirement, and new kinds of risks and opportunities. So companies need to report, is my company faced to a physical risk of climate change? Just to make it more tangible for you, one of our customers 2 years ago lost 2 production sites due to the flood in North Rhine-Westphalia, in the western part of Germany. 2 sites simply flooded, will not be able to be insured anymore. The decision of the company is, at the end of the day, they will not be rebuilt, but replaced by others. That's the carbon price curve. You can see the price development here, starting with 40 euro per ton of carbon dioxide, and now we are in around 90 euro per ton of carbon dioxide. And only a couple of years ago, the price curve was below 10. So of course this is changing the thinking. Of course this makes sure, a market in that case, the price makes sure that climate change suddenly is part of the board management levels and not just of the sustainability department. That's especially true for those companies that do have a high energy consumption and also due to that high emissions. That's the price development within the voluntary markets. There's just a message, there is more than one carbon price. So there are some distinctions, we don't need to go into the details, but they also increased. Corporate sustainability reporting is also driven by legal requirements in the meantime. Maybe many of you know sustainability reports 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, more or less emphasized towards marketing. Some very good, some also very detailed, including a lot of numbers, but not necessarily telling the reader on what are you doing in order to improve your sustainability performance, especially on greenhouse gas emissions. And now this is changing as of next year. Corporates need to report on a compulsory basis, especially climate change related issues, inter alia emissions for all scopes, energy consumption, climate targets and transition plans, plus company specific content. So this means, for example, for a company that at least 400 data points have to be reported. In many cases, especially for medium-sized groups, a completely new business process that needs to be organized. That's the final slide. The main target of a net zero pathway, a transition plan laying behind. That's just an example from one of our clients. In order to, for confidentiality reasons, I do not count the numbers here. You can see a pathway here. We do not change anything, so our emissions will be on a high level. That's a medium pathway, including all measures that pay off within more or less traditional calculations, and that's the climate neutrality pathway. And typical measures are, for example, use of renewable electricity production, making use of own biogenic residues if available. That's, for example, true for the paper industry, for example, or other industries. Rooftop PV, as it is the case already for Gross in Croatia. utilization of electricity or hydrogen for heat supply. So new kinds of infrastructures needed. We also need infrastructures for hydrogen, for example, and those are infrastructures that need to be operated for decades. So to come up with a decision how to install that is not an easy task. For the it's not easy for the consumers, but it's also not easy for the state administrators. Electrification of car fleet, something that already is on the way. Also, that's also a more or less smaller step also for service providers to contribute and also to help to make electric cars economically more viable. I guess it's people like myself that are driving vehicles paid by the company should contribute to it. And in that case, the last step, the renovation of buildings. That's of course completely different if you are looking into a typical residential company. On all the conclusions and the issues to discuss, I would to propose to do that together in the panel. And not now, and as I already know that time is gone. So thank you very much for your patience, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.